Hawthorne Bay woke beneath a sky the color of steel. The old brick buildings surrounding Civic Square looked proud and weary at once, their weathered walls holding the memory of generations. Wind moved through the oak trees lining the street, loosening gold and rust-colored leaves that drifted across the cobblestones in front of the town hall. It was the kind of day that seemed to promise something important without revealing what it would be. Banners hung from the lampposts, each bearing the state seal and the words Justice Reform Conference in bold navy lettering. Reporters were already gathering near the marble steps, testing microphones, adjusting tripods, and speaking in clipped voices about camera positions and official arrivals. Police cruisers lined the perimeter of the square with their lights dark, their presence more ceremonial than urgent. Officers stood at measured intervals, arms folded, scanning the crowd with the practiced detachment of people waiting for an event to begin. Hawthorne Bay had always carried its history carefully, like a heavy coat that no one knew how to remove. Its cobblestones had endured centuries of footsteps. Its church spires caught the light before the rest of the city. Beneath all that beauty ran a current of unfinished business that everyone sensed, even when few were willing to name it. That day, the unfinished business had a title. The Justice Reform Conference had been organized after a troubling series of incidents across the state. Disputed arrests, contested uses of force, and communities left angry, frightened, and unheard. Officials from 3 counties were expected to attend. Judges, attorneys, lawmakers, police leaders, and policy advisors would gather beneath one roof to debate how authority should be exercised and how abuse should be confronted. Somewhere among them, almost entirely unrecognized, was the woman who had written the framework they had all come to discuss. Her name was Camille Langston. She arrived on foot and alone, carrying a worn leather case polished smooth by years of use. A simple charcoal coat rested over a plain blouse. Her low-heeled shoes had been chosen for walking, not for display, and her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who valued purpose over appearance. No car waited at the curb for her. No assistant hurried behind her. No security detail moved through the crowd on her behalf. Camille crossed the square the way she moved through most places, unhurried, observant, and entirely comfortable in her own presence. Some people mistook that composure for arrogance. Others failed to notice her at all. In truth, Camille Langston was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. She had built her career on cases other lawyers dismissed as impossible, and had won enough of them to make powerful institutions uneasy. She had stepped away from courtroom practice to accept a position known to only a small circle of officials, lead advisor on judicial reform for the governor's office. She was the architect of the policy framework at the center of the conference. She had sat across from officers, victims, sergeants, chiefs, grieving families, and people whose lives had been altered by a badge paired with a reckless decision. She had listened to stories that never reached official reports. She had written language intended to reshape how police officers were trained, supervised, investigated, and disciplined throughout the state. She had done all of it without seeking praise because she believed, with quiet certainty, that the work mattered more than the name attached to it. Camille moved toward the steps with the case tucked against her side. The governor's convoy was expected soon. She intended to find a quiet place near the entrance, review her notes once more, and wait. She did not yet know that the short wait ahead of her would become one of the longest and most revealing stretches of her professional life. Officer Derek Vaughn noticed her almost immediately. Howe was muscular, sharp-jawed, and carried himself like a man who believed physical confidence was proof of sound judgment. Assigned to perimeter duty, he considered the post beneath him. He had spent much of the day watching dark sedans and polished town cars deliver officials in a steady procession. Every important person had looked exactly the way he expected importance to look: tailored clothing, purposeful strides, assistants carrying expensive bags. Then he saw Camille walking alone. She carried a case that looked as though it belonged to someone settled into an ordinary career, not someone preparing to shape state policy. She did not fit the pattern Vaughn had built in his mind, and the mismatch lodged inside him like a splinter. He watched her pass the first checkpoint without acknowledging him. Something in him decided that this was wrong, that she did not belong there, that someone needed to stop her, that her confidence itself required explanation. He followed a short distance behind her. When Camille paused near the foot of the steps and opened her case to review a document, Vaughn approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. His voice carried the flatness of a man who had already chosen the answer before asking the question. "This area is restricted to conference attendees. I need to see identification." Camille looked up. Her expression held neither surprise nor offense, only the calm attention of someone accustomed to being asked to prove what others were allowed to assume. "Of course," she said, reaching into the case. The encounter should have ended there. It did not. Vaughn watched her hands while she searched, leaning slightly closer and narrowing his eyes as though waiting to expose a fraud. Camille withdrew an official credential and a printed letter bearing the seal of the governor's office. She handed both to him without ceremony. Vaughn studied the documents for far longer than necessary. His brow tightened, not because anything was wrong, but because he had already decided that something must be. Pedestrians began slowing nearby. They sensed the tension in the same way people sense pressure changing before a storm. That was the moment the day stopped being ordinary. Vaughn turned the letter over, examined the seal, and examined it again. His deliberate scrutiny made one thing increasingly clear. He was not searching for a reason to let her pass. He was searching for a reason to keep her out. Camille waited with her hands loosely folded. She offered no sigh, no glare, and no impatient gesture that could be transformed into an accusation of hostility. She understood this dance. She knew that waiting could sometimes reveal far more than arguing ever would. "Officer," she said at last, her voice steady, "that letter was issued directly by the governor's office. If you are concerned about its authenticity, someone there can confirm it for you." Vaughn's jaw tightened. I was not accustomed to receiving solutions from people he had chosen to question. Her composure irritated him more than anger would have. A small crowd had begun to form at a respectful distance, drawn by the unmistakable shape of a disagreement. "I've seen fake credentials before," Vaughn said, raising his voice enough to attract more attention. "This looks like something printed on a home computer." "It is state letterhead," Camille replied. "There is a verification code at the bottom. You can call it in." Vaughn did not call. Instead, he committed the act that would soon become the most replayed image of the day. I tore the letter in half. The ripping paper sounded unnaturally loud in the open square. Nearby, conversation stopped. Several phones rose almost simultaneously, their cameras turning toward Camille and the officer. Camille did not flinch. She looked at the two torn pieces in Vaughn's hand, then lifted her eyes to his face. Her gaze remained calm, but there was something immovable within it. "You just destroyed state property," she said. "You can explain all of that at the station," Vaughn replied. The answer came too quickly and with less confidence than he intended. Some part of him already understood that he had crossed a line, though he could not yet comprehend how far. Near the edge of the crowd stood a man in a gray suit whose posture revealed a lifetime spent in courtrooms. He recognized what was happening. An officer had committed himself to a story and was now trying to force the facts into it. The man stepped forward, opened his mouth, and hesitated. He was uncertain whether intervention would calm the situation or give it another reason to escalate. He never got the chance to decide. A second officer entered the gathering, and the tension moved from dangerous to inevitable. Sergeant Warren Slade pushed through the crowd with the heavy stride of a man who expected his presence alone to resolve conflict. His broad frame and severe expression had become familiar around Civic Square. He had commanded that section for years and had developed a habit he mistook for loyalty. Whatever his officers decided, he defended, not because he believed they were always right, but because questioning them in public seemed, to him, more dangerous than allowing them to be wrong. Slade surveyed the scene in a single glance, the torn letter, the calm woman, the raised phones, and never once asked what had happened. He planted himself beside Vaughn. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, though his tone made it clear that the question was not an invitation to explain. Camille met his eyes. "Your officer destroyed a letter from the governor's office and has not explained what crime he believes I committed," she said. "I would like to know what I am being accused of." A flicker of uncertainty moved across Slade's face. He buried it almost immediately. "If you're innocent," he said, hardening his voice, "you have nothing to worry about explaining yourself at the station." "I have not been told what I am being charged with," Camille replied. "That is not how this is supposed to work, and you know it." Neither officer answered. Vaughn shifted toward Slade, waiting for the signal that would authorize the next step. The crowd had thickened. People on their way to a conference about justice had stopped to watch justice being abandoned at the foot of the building. The man in the gray suit finally raised a hand. "Officers, there appears to be a misunderstanding that could be resolved with one phone call." He did not finish. Slade gave Vaughn a brief nod. Vaughn reached for the handcuffs on his belt. The metallic click cut across the square. Someone gasped. Another person muttered that this was exactly the behavior the conference was meant to confront. Camille did not run. She did not shout. She did not reach for her phone or demand an attorney. She turned slightly, lifted both hands with her palms open, and offered her wrists. There was something almost unbearable in the stillness of the gesture. It was not surrender. It was certainty. Camille understood exactly how the moment would appear on every recording. She knew how it would be remembered. In the space of one breath, she decided that her dignity would not be measured by resistance, but by the complete absence of it. Vaughn hesitated. For the briefest instant, something beneath his certainty warned him to stop. Then he closed the handcuffs around her wrists. The metal was cold. Camille remained upright, composed, and silent. She did not know every detail of how the scene would end, but she knew it would not end the way Vaughn and Slade imagined. Around her, the crowd divided. Some murmured that she must have done something, clinging to the belief that handcuffs always followed guilt. Others watched with quiet fury, recognizing a pattern so familiar that it barely required explanation. Phones remained raised. The footage had already begun moving beyond Civic Square. A reporter from a local station, who had been preparing a segment about the conference, abandoned her equipment checklist and pushed through the crowd with her cameraman close behind. Other journalists followed. Before long, more cameras were aimed at Camille standing in handcuffs than at any official expected to speak inside the town hall. The gathering became a public gallery split by competing assumptions. An older man in a flannel jacket shook his head and insisted that police would not go this far without cause. A younger woman challenged him immediately, saying she had watched the exchange from the beginning and that Camille had done nothing beyond offering valid documents and speaking calmly. Their disagreement spread through the crowd in smaller pockets. Strangers debated strangers while the woman at the center of the scene remained silent. The video traveled faster than any official statement could have. It passed between phones, appeared in group messages, and reached people in cities Camille had never visited. They did not know her name or her work, but many recognized the shape of what they were watching. News crews that had arrived to discuss reform abandoned their prepared scripts. Statistics and panel schedules suddenly seemed irrelevant beside the immediate sight of a woman being detained for presenting a letter no one had bothered to verify. Tessa Munro, a young reporter assigned to cover the conference, crouched near the edge of the crowd and narrated the scene with the breathless urgency of someone realizing that history had replaced her original assignment. Her cameraman captured Camille, the officers, and the torn pieces of state letterhead near Vaughn's boots. The image would soon appear on screens far beyond Hawthorne Bay. Inside the town hall, whispers moved rapidly among aides and officials. They had gathered to debate misconduct in policy language and now found themselves confronting a living example just beyond the doors. Several stepped outside. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief and then to recognition. The subject of the day's conference was no longer theoretical. Across the city, in the rear seat of an armored sedan moving toward Civic Square, a phone vibrated with a message that changed the direction of the entire day. Governor Everett Caldwell sat reviewing his opening remarks, reading glasses low on his nose, when his chief of staff silently turned the screen toward him. The video was unsteady and filmed from a distance, but there was no mistaking the woman in its center. Camille Langston stood with her hands cuffed in front of her, surrounded by cameras and officers. Governor Caldwell had known Camille for many years. He had watched her argue cases that others lacked the courage to accept. He had personally asked her to lead the state's reform effort. He knew exactly how much of the conference, and how much of the proposed legislation behind it, existed because of her work. "Turn the convoy around," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an order that required no repetition. "Now." The driver did not ask why. The three vehicles changed direction at the next intersection. Emergency lights came alive across the lead car, and sirens began rising as the convoy moved toward the square with an urgency that had nothing to do with ceremony. Back at the town hall, no one knew what was approaching. Vaughn had one hand near Camille's shoulder as he guided her toward a waiting cruiser. His movements were stiff and mechanical, but uncertainty had begun to disturb the confidence he had carried earlier. Slade stood nearby with his arms crossed, glancing at the crowd as though finally realizing that the audience was not inclined to accept his version of events. Then sirens sounded in the distance. They were not the solitary rhythm of a passing patrol car. They were layered, coordinated, and growing louder. Heads turned across the square. Conversations faded. Reporters lowered their microphones and repositioned their cameras. The governor's convoy entered Civic Square in precise formation. 3 black vehicles moved across the cobblestones and stopped smoothly at the base of the steps. For a moment, only the engines spoke. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened. Governor Everett Caldwell stepped out. Every uniformed officer around the square straightened by instinct. Some raised their hands in salute before their minds had fully processed his arrival. Caldwell did not acknowledge them. His attention was fixed on Camille. He crossed the square in long, deliberate strides, his staff following behind. The crowd seemed to draw one collective breath as he approached the woman still wearing handcuffs. He stopped in front of her. "I'm sorry you were kept waiting," he said. The words settled over the square like a stone dropped into still water. No one moved. Vaughn's hand remained near the cuffs. The color slowly drained from his face as the meaning of the governor's apology reached him. Slade lowered his arms. His posture, once rigid with authority, began collapsing into dread. Caldwell turned toward the officers. His expression remained controlled, but beneath it was the unmistakable force of disciplined anger. "Remove those handcuffs," he said, immediately. Vaughn reached for the key. His fingers, so steady when closing the restraints, now struggled to guide it into the lock. The cuffs opened with a soft click. Camille lowered her hands and rubbed one wrist with her thumb. Her expression remained composed. "Thank you, Governor," she said. The simplicity of the words carried more force than outrage could have. A murmur moved through the crowd. Phones remained raised. Who was this woman? Why had the governor redirected his convoy to release her personally? Caldwell turned toward the onlookers and reporters. "Many of you came here for the Justice Reform Conference," he said. "Let me introduce you to the woman who created its foundation." Confusion moved through the crowd. "This is Camille Langston. She serves as the lead advisor on judicial reform for this administration. Every framework being discussed inside, every proposed standard involving use of force, every training measure under review began with her research and bears the imprint of her work." He paused, looking across the faces gathered before him. "She is not merely attending this conference. She is the reason it exists." Reporters began speaking rapidly into microphones. Cameras swung from Camille to Vaughn and Slade. Vaughn opened his mouth, perhaps searching for an explanation strong enough to undo the scene. None came. Slade stared down at the cobblestones. Another dark sedan stopped near the curb. Chief Marissa Hale stepped out with the swift, focused efficiency of someone responding to a crisis that should never have happened. She had built her reputation on one principle. She did not look away simply because the person responsible wore a badge. Chief Hale moved through the crowd, acknowledged the governor with a brief nod, and turned immediately toward the officers. "I want every recording secured," she said. "Body cameras, dash cameras, traffic feeds, and voluntary footage from anyone in this crowd. Nothing is deleted. Nothing is altered. No one reviews evidence without my office receiving a copy." Her instructions left no room for debate. Members of her team entered the square and began gathering statements and preserving footage. An officer approached Vaughn to retrieve his body camera. Hale reviewed the first video on a tablet. She watched Vaughn reject the official documents. She watched him tear the governor's letter. She watched the cuffs close around Camille's wrists. She watched the complete absence of any conduct that could justify detention. No resistance, no violation, no crime. Only an assumption that had hardened into action. "There was no cause," Hale said, almost to herself. Then she lifted her eyes. "None." She faced Vaughn and Slade. "Both of you are suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Surrender your badges and service weapons before leaving this square." Vaughn removed his badge with unsteady hands. The metal caught the pale light before he placed it into the waiting palm of a senior officer. Slade followed. The man who had commanded Civic Square for years now stood empty-handed before the crowd he had assumed would instinctively believe him. Camille watched without satisfaction. When Hale turned toward her, perhaps expecting a demand for punishment, Camille spoke quietly. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want this handled correctly, and I want it to change something beyond what happened to me." Hale studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." Governor Caldwell stepped forward and addressed the crowd again. "The conference will continue," he said, "but its agenda has changed. What happened in this square is not separate from the work we came here to do. It is the work we came here to do." Questions erupted from the press. Caldwell raised one hand, signaling that further statements would come later. Then he turned toward Camille and offered his arm, not as a performance of rank, but as a simple gesture of human courtesy after an indignity no one should have endured. "Shall we?" he asked. Camille retrieved the leather case that had fallen during the confrontation. She straightened her coat and nodded. "Let's finish what we started." Together, they climbed the marble steps. Behind them, Civic Square remained filled with cameras, murmurs, and two officers confronting the first public consequences of decisions made before they had bothered to learn the truth. Inside the town hall, the conference began beneath an atmosphere entirely different from the one organizers had planned. News of the confrontation had reached every seat before the first speaker approached the podium. The usual polite energy of official gatherings had been replaced by something raw and urgent. Conversations were quieter. Faces were more attentive. People who had arrived prepared to discuss distant examples now understood that the subject of reform had unfolded within sight of the entrance. Governor Caldwell walked onto the stage carrying his prepared remarks. He set them aside. "We gathered here to discuss reform in the language institutions prefer," he said. "Policy provisions, training modules, statistical benchmarks. This day has reminded us that reform is not an abstraction." The room held still. Outside these doors, a woman presented a valid invitation and was placed in handcuffs because she did not resemble the image someone had formed of who belonged here. A murmur moved through the hall. Some listeners nodded. Others shifted uneasily in their seats. Caldwell gestured toward Camille, who stood beside the panel table. "I could tell you what reform should look like, but I would rather you hear from the woman who built the framework before us, and who has already demonstrated, more powerfully than any prepared speech could, why this work matters." Camille approached the podium and placed her worn leather case on a small table. For several moments, she said nothing. She allowed the silence to settle until the room was ready to hear rather than merely listen. "I did not intend to begin by discussing what happened outside," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, and clear enough to reach the farthest row without strain. "But perhaps it is appropriate. I have spent a great deal of time trying to describe through policy language what the square demonstrated in a few painful moments." She paused. "Reform is not simply the punishment of individual officers after individual failures. It is the creation of systems in which those failures are less likely to occur, and in which, when they do occur, accountability is immediate, transparent, and consistent, regardless of the person involved." No one interrupted. "The system responded today," Camille continued. "Eventually, but it should never require a governor's convoy, a crowd of witnesses, or a viral recording to function properly. It should work for every person, every time, including when no one important is watching and no camera is present." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of people absorbing an uncomfortable truth. Chief Hale stood near a side entrance, tablet still in hand. She watched Camille with the stern satisfaction of someone who had spent a career refusing to protect poor judgment simply because it wore a uniform. During a recess, Derek Vaughn returned to the square. He stood alone near the place where he had torn Camille's letter. The paper had already been collected and cataloged as evidence, but the sound of it ripping remained vivid in his mind. Howe was still there when Camille stepped outside seeking a moment of quiet. She stopped several feet away and said nothing, leaving him the space to speak or remain silent. Vaughn turned toward her. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. In its place was something exposed and uncertain. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been at any point during their encounter. "Not because I was caught, because I was wrong. I built a story about you before I gave you a chance to tell me who you were. Somewhere inside me, I knew that was what I was doing, and I continued anyway." Camille regarded him without cruelty and without immediate forgiveness. "I appreciate your saying that," she replied, "but an apology is a beginning, not a conclusion." Vaughn lowered his eyes. "What happened was not only about you and me," she continued. "It was part of a pattern that unfolds in streets, doorways, businesses, and public spaces across this state. Most of those moments are never recorded. Most do not end with a governor arriving." She held his gaze. "If you want your apology to mean something, it must appear in how you conduct yourself from this point forward, not only in what you say to me now." Vaughn nodded slowly. The words did not offer him relief, but they gave him a direction. Sergeant Slade stood a short distance away, watching with the discomfort of a man unused to being forced into self-examination. Camille turned toward him. "I imagine you have something to say as well." Slade straightened reflexively, bracing for anger. "I told him to arrest you," he said. "I could have asked questions. I could have slowed everything down instead of defending his judgment the moment I arrived." His voice tightened. "I spent years believing that leadership meant standing behind my officers no matter what. I understand now that it does not. Sometimes leadership means asking whether they are right before choosing to defend them." Camille studied him. "That is a difficult lesson," she said. "I hope it remains with you after the attention fades." Slade nodded. Chief Hale later announced that both officers would face a complete formal review. The investigation would examine not only their personal actions, but also the training and supervisory practices that had allowed unsupported suspicion to become detention. The possible consequences included unpaid suspension, extensive retraining, and revised requirements for documenting probable cause. Hale emphasized that the incident would not be dismissed as the isolated failure of two individuals. It would trigger a department-wide examination of how officers distinguished evidence from instinct and instinct from bias. The conference resumed. Governor Caldwell returned to the podium and announced that the reform proposal developed under Camille's leadership would be expanded. New provisions would require stronger documentation and independent review of stop and detain encounters. The language would address the very gaps that had allowed Vaughn and Slade to escalate a peaceful exchange based on nothing more than personal judgment. "We designed these policies to prevent what happened outside," Caldwell said. "The events in the square prove that the need is real. They also prove that good intentions mean nothing without enforceable standards." The audience did not answer with immediate applause. Instead came the quieter sound of genuine engagement, pens moving over paper, pages turning, and people leaning closer as implementation replaced rhetoric. Near the back of the room, a group of younger officers sat in thoughtful silence. One rookie leaned toward the colleague beside her and admitted that she had sometimes made quick assumptions about who looked as though they belonged in a place. Watching the confrontation had forced her to confront how easily untested instinct could disguise itself as professional judgment. Her colleague admitted the same. For the rest of the session, they listened differently. Camille noticed the exchange from the panel table. She did not call attention to it. That private recalibration was exactly the kind of change the work was designed to produce. Not dramatic declarations, but quiet corrections within people who would return to ordinary patrols and carry those corrections into moments no one else would ever witness. During the final panel, a state legislator asked Camille whether the incident had weakened her confidence in the reforms or merely revealed how far the state still had to go. Camille considered the question. "Both," she answered. "What happened proved that the instincts we are trying to correct are present and real, not theoretical. It also demonstrated that accountability can still force a system to correct itself when the proper structures exist." She paused before adding the part she believed mattered most. "My hope is that one day, corrections like the one we saw will occur quietly through process before harm becomes public spectacle and before a victim needs influence to be believed." The legislator wrote something in his notes. The discussion turned toward funding, training, oversight, and implementation, the unglamorous machinery upon which real reform depended. At Camille's request, Vaughn and Slade were allowed to observe the conference under Chief Hale's supervision. She did not make the request to humiliate them. She wanted them to hear the policies whose necessity they had demonstrated so clearly. By the time the formal sessions ended, the sun had begun slipping behind the old city's spires, leaving amber and rose across the sky. The crowd outside had thinned. Reporters packed cables into cases. Curious onlookers returned to errands and obligations interrupted by the spectacle. Civic Square settled back toward its ordinary rhythm. Wind moved through the oak branches and sent another scattering of gold and rust-colored leaves across the cobblestones. Camille stepped out of the town hall alone, just as she had arrived. She carried the same worn leather case, though its contents seemed heavier now, not with documents, but with the weight of everything the day had exposed and confirmed. She paused at the top of the marble steps. Below her was the place where she had stood in handcuffs, with cameras surrounding her and strangers debating whether she deserved what they were watching. The square no longer held suspicious whispers. No officer stepped forward to ask whether she belonged there. The city had returned to its indifference. Camille recognized that indifference as its own quiet freedom, the ability to cross a public space without being forced to justify her presence. She descended the steps. Her shoes echoed softly against the stone. The remaining daylight caught the edges of the falling leaves and turned them gold before the shadows deepened. Behind her, the lights inside the town hall remained on. Officials continued refining the policy she had built, now with a sharper understanding of why every line mattered. Those policies had never been written merely to punish people like Derek Vaughn after their failures. They existed to make fewer such failures possible. They existed to slow certainty long enough for evidence to enter the room. They existed to ensure that leadership meant scrutiny rather than automatic protection, and that accountability did not depend on the social position of the person harmed. Chief Hale's investigation continued after the conference. Every recording was preserved. Witnesses were interviewed. The torn invitation became physical evidence of the moment Vaughn had chosen suspicion over verification. Slade's decision to support him without asking a single meaningful question became evidence of a second failure, the kind created not by one officer's bias, but by a supervisor's refusal to challenge it. The review extended beyond them. Training records were examined. Probable cause documentation was audited. Department policy was compared against what officers were actually taught in briefing rooms and what supervisors tolerated in public. The purpose was not to pretend that one investigation could cure every failure. It was to refuse the easier lie that nothing larger had been revealed. Camille returned to her work. She reviewed amendments, challenged vague language, and pressed officials to replace promises with measurable obligations. The incident in Civic Square did not become the center of her identity, nor did she allow anyone to use her experience as an excuse to turn structural reform into a celebration of one exceptional woman. Whenever someone described her composure as heroic, she redirected the conversation. The real question, she insisted, was not why she had remained calm. It was why calm documentation, official credentials, and complete cooperation had still failed to protect her from unsupported suspicion. The real measure of the reforms would not be whether someone with access to a governor could receive justice. It would be whether the same process worked for a person with no powerful phone number, no official title, and no crowd recording what happened. Vaughn carried Camille's words with him into the review process. Whether they would change him permanently remained unanswered. An apology spoken beneath public pressure was easy compared with the private discipline of confronting bias when no one was present to praise the effort. Slade faced an equally difficult reckoning. For years, he had confused loyalty with leadership. The investigation forced him to examine every earlier occasion when he had defended a subordinate before understanding what had happened. The question was no longer whether he had protected his officers. It was whom that protection had harmed. Neither man was offered easy absolution. Camille had never promised it. She had offered them something harder: responsibility. The conference's revised policy package moved forward with new protections built directly from the failures witnessed in the square. Stop and detain decisions required written, factual justification. Supervisors were required to document the questions they asked before endorsing an arrest. Credential disputes involving government events had to be verified through designated channels rather than an officer's personal assessment of whether someone appeared important. Independent reviewers gained access to body camera footage without waiting for approval from the same command structures being examined. These changes were procedural, technical, and far less dramatic than a governor's convoy arriving with sirens. That was precisely why they mattered. Spectacle could correct one public wrong. Procedure could prevent countless private ones. Hawthorne Bay settled into night, the way cities always do, carrying the events of the day unevenly. Some residents would remember the convoy. Others would remember the cuffs. Reporters would replay the torn letter because it gave the story a clean visual beginning. Camille would remember something quieter. She would remember the instant Vaughn looked at valid evidence and chose not to see it. She would remember the brief hesitation before the handcuffs closed, the small opening in which a different decision had still been possible. That was the space reform had to reach. Not merely the hearing room after harm had occurred, but the private moment before certainty became action. Camille crossed the nearly empty square and continued toward the street beyond. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Justice did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it lived in a verification code that someone refused to call. Sometimes it appeared in the steady hands of a woman offering her wrists because she understood that the truth was already being documented. Sometimes it took the form of policies written late into the evening by people determined to make dignity less dependent on power. And sometimes it moved through an old public square in the unhurried footsteps of a woman who had proven, without shouting, that no human being could be accurately measured by the assumptions others made before bothering to ask who she was.